you ever fantasize about being killed?
Welcome back to A History of Horror. Today we're going to be looking at a very important movie to me. 1985's The Return of the Living Dead, directed by Dan O'Bannon. It was the first zombie movie that I ever watched as a kid, and one of the last films that I owned on VHS. I saw it at the right place, right time, and at the right age for it to immediately turn me into a fan. I remember there being no one at my school who had seen the movie, which really sucked because there was no one to talk to about it. This was before social media, so it wasn't easy finding people who appreciated older movies, especially ones featuring zombies. A lot of people confuse it to be a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, but it's a completely different scenario and a different type of zombie. The reason behind the confusing title is all legal. John Russo co-wrote the original Night and split the rights so that he could use Living Dead and George Romero could use The Dead for future projects. That's why Romero's sequel is Dawn of the Dead rather than Dawn of the Living Dead. I'm not a fan of John Russo personally. He directed the 30th anniversary edition of Night of the Living Dead, which was awful, and he later produced Children of the Living Dead, which is one of the worst movies that I'd ever seen. So thankfully, after completing the story for Return of the Living Dead, Dan O'Bannon bought the rights and completely rewrote the script. The story begins with the young guy Freddy getting a job at a medical supply warehouse. From the get-go, we get a taste of the macabre with an array of skeletons, split dogs for veterinary schools, and actual cadavers. Now I mentioned that John Russo had written the original script, but his version was meant to be a direct sequel to the classic 1968 film. When O'Bannon rewrote it, he took the movie in a different direction and created a universe where the events of Night of the Living Dead were all true and had been covered up as a government secret. Freddy's boss tells him the chilling story of what actually happened, casually mentioning that some of the hibernating zombies had been accidentally shipped to the warehouse. They go down to the basement to check them out, but they accidentally release the chemical.
Hey, these things don't leak, do they?
Leak? Hell no, these things were made by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Which not only brings back the zombie in the tank, but reanimates everything in the warehouse, including the split dogs. They bring one of the reanimated bodies to a nearby mortuary to burn in the crematorium, but this only makes matters worse, since the smoke rises as there's a thunderstorm over the cemetery next door. What makes the event more exciting is that while all this is happening, some local punk kids are partying in the cemetery, and they end up getting mixed up in the whole mess. It's perhaps the first meta-zombie movie that subverts our expectations. After seeing the other Romero movies, you'd expect that a quick blow or a gunshot to the head would kill the zombie instantly, but not in this case. Every nerve acts independently to the point where if you cut off the head, the rest of the body would still come after you.
I thought you said if we destroyed the brain, it'd die.
It worked in the movie!
Well, it ain't working now.
This is also the first wave of zombies to exclusively eat brains rather than flesh. They go into detail of why this is, but I'll try not to spoil too much of the movie. All I'll say is that they used real cow brains here, and the extras were paid bonuses if they were willing to actually eat them. They're also fast, smart, and able to set traps. So it goes without saying, if these are the kind of zombies that we ever have to deal with, I can confidently say that we are fucked. The zombies look great, each hideous and gruesome. The famous Tarman stands out among the others for not only acting solo, but for the authentic choreography of actor Alan Trotman. The way he walks makes it really seem like his limbs are barely attached. Return of the Living Dead is a great horror comedy because it never stops being scary, but it's still entertaining throughout. Some could call it the ultimate Gen X film because it has a very nihilistic counterculture attitude that seems reflective of the time the movie was made. As the 1980s went on, there was a vibe of pessimism and cynicism among the youth. Where the baby boomers saw a man walk on the moon, Gen X saw the Challenger explode. There was also the looming threat of nuclear war, periodic acid rain, disease, and a constant us versus them mentality. Still, with the angle of Return of the Living Dead, the gratuitous nudity and gore, and one of the best movie soundtracks of all time, it stands out as one of my top favorite movies. It was tough choosing which movie to cover for this time period. 1985 was a great year for zombie fans, as George Romero released Day of the Dead, and later on we got to see Re-Animator, based on the story by H.P. Lovecraft. I was initially feeling bad about not being able to cover everything, but then I remembered that nothing is stopping me from talking about all three of these, so that's what I'm gonna do. Day of the Dead has the strongest intro that I've ever seen in a zombie movie. In the first 5 minutes, we see how far society has crumbled and the magnitude of the outbreak. The zombies creeping out of buildings and migrating en masse toward a small team of survivors, there's no need for an exposition. We just know the world is fucked. The rest of the movie takes place in a hidden cavern that's been turned into a military bunker. A team of scientists work to find a cure or something. I don't know. They never really clarify what their mission actually is. Joining them is a platoon of soldiers led by Captain Rhodes, played by Joe Pilato. Captain Rhodes steals the show as he's one of the best villains I've seen in a horror movie.
I just told you I was willing to kill you if you didn't get back in your chair. You didn't get back in your chair.
He creates a harsh tension in every scene that he's in, and you can't take your eyes off of him. With the feud building among the survivors and the environment driving everyone crazy, it gives a sense that people are the real monsters and the few rational ones just happen to be caught in the middle. There's also Sarah, the only female in the movie. She takes the protagonist role, making her perhaps the first woman in a zombie film who isn't just a side character. There's an animosity between the two groups as they have a conflict in ideologies. I think Romero was trying to display the destructive authoritarian nature of the military, but after serving in the army myself, I have to say, I totally get where both sides are coming from. Sometimes I even find myself siding with Rhodes on a few issues. The makeup and gore are top notch to go along with the higher budget. It seems like Tom Savini was given a blank check and told to go above and beyond. The zombies look terrifying, the gore consists of plenty of blood and entrails courtesy of local slaughterhouses, and the movie is brutal with every kill. People don't just die in Day of the Dead, they get fucking ripped apart. While I was in college, a friend of mine brought over a copy of Re-Animator. I never read the original story by H.P. Lovecraft, so I don't know if the movie does any justice, but for a film full of gore and zombies, it was enough for me to give it a shot. Looking back, it reminds me of the Hammer versions of Frankenstein from the 1960s, focusing on a mad scientist obsessed with his work and willing to kill people if it meant getting further with his research. The scientist here is Herbert West, played by Jeffrey Combs. He's a complete asshole, but you find yourself rooting for him the whole time as sort of an anti-hero. He has clever quips and is quite grim, but somehow always comes off as funny. While renting a room at his friend's house, he develops a strange glowing serum that has the power to bring the dead back to life. He starts off with reanimating a cat, then later graduates to human specimens, each becoming insanely aggressive as they return as zombies. There's another scientist who wants to steal the serum and his research, and this culminates into a battle of wits between the two. It's a fun and cheesy ride with gratuitous amounts of gore and gruesome special effects. There's even an oddly erotic scene featuring one of the reanimated and a naked girl strapped to a gurney. It's a bit rapey, but what are you gonna do? It was the 80s. The special effects are relatively cheap compared to today's standards, but they're all conventional without the use of CGI, so all the blood and guts are very effective. So we had 3 great zombie movies that came out in 1985. There was also Fright Night, but that swayed more into vampires, which are still cool in their own way. Later on, we would have a revival of the zombie subgenre in the early 2000s, with 28 Days Later and the remake of Dawn of the Dead. And then a few years after that, we'd see an avalanche of zombie movies and TV shows, following the money trail that was left by Walking Dead. It seemed that in the 2010s, zombies were more popular than ever and in the mainstream for the first time. I was mildly annoyed by this, to be honest, but I won't get into the details of that. Maybe I will when we get to the 2000s, but for now, I'll just leave on the note that 1985 was one of the best years for horror.